Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be with you. I hope you can all hear me well. Um, to be here, in fact, with two of my heroes, in fact, three, David Matas and Erwin Cutler and John Packer, is a special honor. These are people that I consider my mentors. And so it's a huge honor for me to be speaking here at this same meeting. What I want to do today is talk to you about the United Nations because Genocide Watch has a memorandum of understanding with the UN Office of the Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide. In fact, we were the organization that proposed creation of that office back in 2000, and then lobbied for it at the top of the UN, and and Kofi Annan created the Office of Special Advisor in 2004. The reason, though, that I'm so concerned right now is that the United Nations has failed to stop war and failed to stop genocide. And what I want to do today is talk about why that has happened. Because the UN hasn't failed as an organization, it has done a huge amount of good to the world. World Health Organization, UNICEF, the Food and Agriculture, so all these things that are UN agencies have contributed tremendously to world peace and to the interconnections of people all around the world. But the UN Security Council has failed. And that is something I want to talk to you today. In fact, I want to also propose what some people would consider a utopian or, wild-eyed proposal. But I will explain that a little later. I believe it is time to rewrite the Charter of the United Nations. And I'll explain why. During the 20th century, over 100 million people were murdered by their own governments. That's more deaths than from all the wars combined. Genocide is committed by people who've lost sight of our common humanity. All humans belong to one family. But we're born into thousands of ethnic groups that speak thousands of languages. We belong to hundreds of nations and have scores of religions. Some think there are many races, but that's not true. There's really only one race, the human race. Genocide is committed by us because we become ethnocentric, racist, nationalist, or religiously intolerant. In fact, speaking as a believer myself, I believe genocide is idolatry. We worship our ethnic group, or race, or nation, or religion instead of the one God that created us. We build golden altars and sacrifice human beings upon them. Instead of cherishing every human being, we bathe our weapons with their blood. World War II was the deadliest war in human history. 85 million people perished. Military deaths totaled 25 million, including the deaths of 5 million prisoners of war. Civilian deaths totaled 55 million. Soviet Union alone lost 27 million people. 19 million people died in China, including 8 to 9 million to famine and disease. Following World War II, the victors in World War II were determined to prevent future wars. And so they founded the UN, the United Nations, in 1945. So why has the United Nations failed to prevent war and genocide? The primary reason is that since its founding, the UN has been crippled by the Permanent Five veto, the veto of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Keep in mind where the world was in 1945. It was still a colonial era. The colonial powers, including the UK, France, Russia, and China, wanted to keep their empires. the most powerful nation, the United States, wanted to maintain its military and economic dominance. So these five nations insisted on having vetoes in the UN Security Council. Security Council is the only body under the UN Charter with the legal power to authorize the use of military force. So if even one of these Perm 5 nations vetoes, the UN cannot authorize military interventions. From the beginning, Soviet vetoes paralyzed the Security Council, and the Perm 5 veto has paralyzed the UN ever since. It is a fatal flaw in the UN Charter. To get around Soviet vetoes and to provide a future alternative to the Security Council, the U.S. sponsored Resolution 377A, the Uniting for Peace Resolution. It states that in cases when one of its five permanent members uses its veto, so the Security Council cannot maintain international peace and security, which is its purpose, the General Assembly shall consider the matter immediately and may issue recommendations to UN members for collective measures, including the use of armed force when necessary, to maintain or restore international security and peace. Note that Uniting for Peace doesn't allow the General Assembly to authorize a UN peacekeeping force, but what it does allow is that collective measures may be taken, in other words, alliance activities. That was, for example, what happened in Korea. It's what's happened 11 times since the Suez Crisis, Congo. There's still a situation up in Lebanon. I mean, we have, in other words, other instances of use of Uniting for Peace. And in fact, the most recent one is the activities of the United Nations on Ukraine, because clearly, if it had been taken to the Security Council, Russia would have simply vetoed everything. So United for Peace was invoked, and the General Assembly took that issue. Now, how does it work? Well, if there is a veto in the Security Council, then the General Assembly shall continue the matter immediately and may issue recommendations. In order to do that, the mechanism that was created was the emergency special session of the General Assembly. And emergency special sessions have been convened under this procedure on 11 occasions. As I say, the most recent was in February 2022 about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, although the U.S. originally sponsored the Uniting for Peace resolution, the U.S. has now become reluctant to use it. When I was a Foreign Service officer in the U.S. State Department lawyers told me, oh, we don't favor Uniting for Peace anymore because in the General Assembly, the U.S. has no veto. The U.S., however, did support Uniting for Peace after Russia invaded Ukraine. I believe that the U.S. and other members of the Perm 5 and members of the Security Council should use Uniting for Peace much more often to authorize armed UN peacekeeping missions when genocides begin and to arrest their perpetrators. But I actually want to go beyond that because I'm convinced that we not only need a mechanism like Uniting for Peace, which was effectively the most basic structural change that has occurred in the structure of the United Nations decision making, we need a new UN charter. The current charter doesn't work. Because it allows for the Perm 5 veto, the Security Council, which is the one agency that is able to authorize use of force, has been paralyzed from the beginning in many, many cases. There was a period in the 1990s, in fact, when I was in the State Department, when the Soviet Union had fallen apart and the Soviet Union was not using the veto anymore, and Russia wasn't vetoing, and China has never liked to veto, when we were able to create a number of UN peacekeeping resolutions. And I, in fact, wrote a number of those myself, and the tribunals And in other words, it was a period when, in fact, the Security Council could function the way it was supposed to. But that period has now passed. We need to rewrite the charter. Now, one of the reasons that I say this is I'm a lawyer as well as an anthropologist. Uh, and where I went to law school, Yale Law School, I was taught that law and policy aren't two separate realms. Their law is concretized policy, and law should be evaluated as policy. And because I'm also a cultural anthropologist, I am trained to look beneath the surface for the deeper structures and schisms that underlie societies and conflicts. In fact, an anthropological analysis of lawyers actually helps us also to understand why the Genocide Convention has failed to prevent genocide, because it was born toothless. Lawyers have kept it from ever outgrowing its baby teeth. The training of lawyers creates a backward-looking, adjudication-oriented view of genocide. One time, a lawyer colleague of mine said, the convention was primarily meant to adjudicate an individual's criminal responsibility. Think about that. If that's the case, then it'll always be too late to prevent. And that is still the case with many State Department lawyers, and it's the official policy of the UK Foreign Office, who says that you can't even use the word genocide until a court uses it. Now, that's not required by the Genocide Convention, but what it does provides an excuse for never using the requirement under the Genocide Convention that we prevent genocide. Remember, the convention is named the International Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the crime of genocide. If we don't prevent, we'll always be too late. So what we have to do is look at why the UN has failed to prevent genocide. First of all, the UN itself is built on the old nation-state system. National governments still claim the right to commit crimes, even genocide, against their own citizens. Now, the Responsibility to Protect doctrine was supposed to overcome this claim. R2P says that sovereignty doesn't come down from rulers, but rather rises up from the people. And that, by the way, is the same principle of sovereignty that behind the American Revolution, behind, the revolution in France, behind all of the Enlightenment concepts of sovereignty, which used to be from the king down. Well, we know that sovereignty comes from the people up. And when the people are abused by their own governments, they have the right to overthrow that government. So under R2P, the UN and regional organizations have the right to intervene in nations that are murdering their own citizens. So why doesn't it happen? I mean, sometimes it does happen. Regional organizations, in fact, have turned out to be the most effective way to intervene to stop and prevent genocides. ECOWAS's intervention in Sierra Leone and Liberia are examples where they stopped two genocides. ASEAN's intervention in East Timor stopped a genocide. The NATO intervention in Kosovo stopped a genocide. So it's regional organizations, in fact, that have turned out to be the most useful in actually stopping and preventing genocide. And yet, very few nations are willing to sacrifice the blood of their own military troops to carry out such R2P interventions. R2P is not yet enforceable international law. It's a universal declaration of human rights type of aspirational doctrine. It's still rejected, in fact, by all genocidal states. Many Asian and African nations, as well as Russia and China, see it as an attempt by Europe and the US to reimpose colonial rule. In fact, when it was invoked in the case of Libya, the failure to actually carry out all of the steps of the responsibility to protect, which include the responsibility to rebuild, were not, in fact, completed. And so ever since there's the intervention in Libya, Libya has been in chaos. we didn't rebuild, and we didn't insist that Libya be rebuilt in a way that gave its people the right to rule themselves. The second reason why the UN has failed is there's still no UN military force. Now, one is authorized under the UN Charter by Articles 43 through 47, which is supposed to create a military staff committee, which would be composed of chiefs of staff of the military forces of the PERM 5 Security Council members. Well, guess what? These are the same PERM 5 Security Council members who veto things in the Security Council. And the result was they've never wanted a UN military force because that force could, in fact, oppose their own armies. So currently, UN peacekeeping missions are usually too weak to overpower national armies. They can't stop genocides. I believe it is time to create a UN military force like NATO's, but without NATO's requirement of unanimity to take military action. So how do we get there? Well, we're going to have to reform the basic structure of the United Nations to do this. And that's why I'm suggesting that we need to call what is called a General Conference to rewrite the Charter. The third reason why the UN has failed to prevent genocide is that the International Criminal Court has no police force to arrest people it charges. Courts can't work without police forces. Today, there's no international police force to arrest people like Bashir and others who've been charged with crimes by the International Criminal Court or by international tribunals. We realized that first with the ICTY, the Yugoslav Tribunal, when it literally could not get any defendants for the first couple of years. That is why, by the way, I wrote not only the Resolution 955 to create the Rwandan Tribunal, but also Resolution 978, which called upon all UN members to turn over anyone in their country against whom they had evidence that they actually participated or were perpetrators in the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda. As a result of that resolution, and when you say called upon, that means you do it in the UN language. In fact, we got most of the very top leaders of that genocide within the first couple of years. We had Bagosora himself. In fact, just a week ago, I was in Tanzania at the what they call the residual mechanism of the ICTR, and talked to the very same prosecutor who prosecuted Bagosora. What a wonderful thing to be able to meet that man, because I actually met and talked to Bagosora before he was tried and convicted of genocide. He never admitted that he'd done anything wrong, but it was a real pleasure for me to meet the man who put him behind bars. Usually, however, unless a regime's been overthrown, as it was in Rwanda, and as it was in Cambodia, for instance, you can't arrest people because national police forces usually obey the leaders of the countries that are in fact committing the genocides. They usually refuse to arrest them because the police actually serve under the same leaders that have committed the genocide. So that is why the ICC needs its own police force. I also believe a police force is needed to prevent genocide by arresting national leaders who are planning or perpetrating a genocide. That is why a resolution we have written to create, or to recreate, I should say, UNAMID, which is the UN peacekeeping force in Sudan that was in Sudan for many years, but then was withdrawn in 2020. And now look what's happened. And the UN resolution that we have written and sent to all of the UN Security Council members would recreate that that peacekeeping force, or I would really call it a peacemaking force, but would also have 715 police authorized to actually arrest anyone who had been charged by the ICC. That would be the first time that a UN peacekeeping resolution has had that authority. It was such a frustration to watch people like Mladic and Karadzic and others just zoom through the checkpoints in Bosnia, even after they were indicted by the ICTY, because the UNPROFOR, the UN force there, didn't have the authority or mandate to actually arrest them when they went through. Well, this would give this peacekeeping force that mandate. So we need international police. Uh, so I would like to say that that is one thing we can write into a new charter. Uh, there is another way to do it, however, even if we don't rewrite the charter. The International Criminal Court is governed by the Rome Statute, and it could be amended with an optional protocol to, in fact, authorize creation of a police force. And that wouldn't even require authorization by the UN Security Council. The police force, in other words, doesn't have to go through the UN. It could be created by the International Criminal Court Assembly of States Parties itself. We have also proposed, by the way, an optional protocol that would reaffirm the authority of the UN General Assembly to approve the use of force when the UN Security Council is paralyzed. And it would, even though it's already very clear that it's possible under the United for Peace resolution, this would, in fact, provide the procedures necessary to constitute such a such an intervention. It would especially authorize regional organizations to act under Chapter 8 of the UN Charter, which gives them authorization even before they receive a UN Security Council mandate under the current charter. I would just add another factor here. The UN is not some kind of isolated, entity. It is part of the international social and political system. What we need to do is face the fact that very few educational systems aim to create anti-genocidal cultures. Genocide requires popular participation. Our estimate is 200,000 people participated in the slaughter of 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus in Rwanda in 1994. Churches in Rwanda could have played a powerful role in creating a culture resistant to genocide in Rwanda, because many Hutus and Tutsis are Roman Catholics and Protestants and attended the same churches. But the church was as ethnically divided or caste divided, however you want to look at the society in Rwanda, as the rest of Rwandan society. In fact, some clergy even participated in the killings. The church failed. Now it is succeeding in bringing reconciliation to Rwanda. In fact, I believe Rwanda is one of the most hopeful countries in the world because of that. What I would like to do is that we need to put an emphasis on the bottom-up dimension of genocide prevention. How can anti-genocidal cultures be built? I believe religion, which has too often been a cause of genocide, could become a core principle for preventing genocide. And we've even talked to the Pope about this, Pope Francis. I was glad that he survived his most recent illness, because one of our people who was working in Genocide Watch actually talked to the Pope about going to, about making the Sunside. Uh, there's a modern communication. The Pope was completely in favor of getting the Roman Catholic Church involved in the anti-genocide movement. And so we're going to be following up on that. Can you imagine if we get the Roman Catholic Church, probably the most successful organization in human history, to become a major part of the genocide movement? After all, what the doctrines of the church teach are all the principles we need to oppose genocide. Jesus affirmed that we're all part of the same human race. So did the Prophet Muhammad. I mean, this is something that is central to the world's religions. Let's use religion to, in fact, overcome these ethnocentric, racist, nationalistic, and otherwise divisive parts of our being as human beings. I would add another point here. To end genocide and war, women must be empowered. I have studied this for all of my 78 years now. Although I didn't have any sisters, so maybe it was after my mother gave up after having four boys and they decided to adopt girls. And so I do have four sisters. But what I learned from being with women over my lifetime is that women resolve conflicts very differently than men. Now, I don't know whether it's genetic or it's because of the way women are raised and because men are raised this way. I believe, though, however, as an anthropologist, since it seems to be universal, it's probably built into us. And the result is when men have conflicts, they fight. When women have conflicts, they talk. Now, I know for a sure thing that talking is a much better way to resolve conflicts than fighting. Not a single war or genocide in human history that I have studied has been planned by groups of women. That is an elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. Uh, it doesn't mean women don't participate in wars or genocide, because they do. But wars or genocides are always planned by men. Uh, One would say, well, maybe the women haven't had the power. But it's been true even when a queen is head of state. The only exception that I know about was a mad monarch of Madagascar named Queen Ranavalona the First, uh, who just used regular warfare, forced labor, and harsh trials by ordeal uh, to decimate her own population. It wasn't intentional genocide. She didn't mean to kill them all. It just had a huge mortality rate, and so the population was cut in half from 1833 to 1839. It's the only case I know of where you can really blame a woman who was the leader. So I think that's the exception that proves the rule. In fact, women don't plan wars or genocides. Many more nations must elect women as their leaders. Women must be empowered. They must be the people we listen to when we're trying to resolve international and ethnic conflicts. Finally, we have to create the political will to prevent genocide. Now, many people said, the Rwandan genocide in Bosnia and Darfur uh, didn't occur because of absence of early warning, because there was plenty of early warning. In fact, I went directly to the president of uh, Rwanda in 1989, had a meeting with him. I was living in Rwanda then, because I could see all the early warning signs. By then, I'd developed the stages of genocide approach to looking at the early warning signs. All of them were there, and I got a meeting. I had dinner, in fact, with the president of the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, Joseph and I said, can't you abolish these ethnic identities on the ID cards? He said, no, we can't, because we don't have judicial review here. We don't have the power to strike down that kind of law. You have to go talk to the president. So I got an appointment with President Habyarimana, and we talked over some of the things I had discovered, and they'd asked me to take a look at the Rwandan judicial system. I, by the way, recommend that they adopt the Gachicha trial system, which I thought would work much better than the Belgium imposed trial system that they were using. And it has, in fact, turned out to be true later when President Kagame uh, put it in place to try many of the people who participated in the Rwandan genocide. Uh, but those genocides were quite predictable. And even when there is a peacekeeping force on the ground, the genocides have continued. Uh, UNIMIR was voted out of Rwanda, led by the US, by the UK, and other members of the Perma when that genocide began. This is something that I knew because I was in the State Department. I had top secret clearance. It was secret for many years. The US had ships off the coast of East Africa on April 6th and 7th when that genocide began in Rwanda. Uh, They had ships off the coast with thousands of U.S. Marines. Now, my son was a U.S. Marine. Believe me, if those U.S. Marines had been deployed to Rwanda instead of just sitting on those ships, that genocide could have been stopped because many of the people who were fleeing from the genocidists fled into churches. This was General Dallaire's plan, in fact. He asked for reinforcements. What if we'd sent those 1,000 Marines in as these reinforcements? What if France had? What if British had? What if other countries had? I believe that was a preventable genocide. The same thing happened in Yugoslavia, in Bosnia. And there, the uh, pacifist head of UNPROFOR wouldn't allow any real retaliation against the Bosnian Serb snipers. He was finally replaced after the Srebrenica genocide. Uh, that same ability to get political will is what made those things possible. That you finally had a willingness to intervene, led by leaders who were willing to do so. Now, what political will is not a mystery. You know, it's not mystical mumbo jumbo that's impossible to analyze and understand. Anyone who witnessed the triumph of the political campaigns of President Obama should see that. Political will can be built from the ground up. I believe it's time to do that, to hold our leaders to account. We must no longer accept their excuses. When President Clinton said we did not know in Kigali after the genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda, he was lying. He knew. In fact, it had been predicted months in advance. Of course he knew. Uh, in fact, I read the cables myself because I had the clearance to do so. Uh, and in fact, on the very first day of that genocide, our deputy chief of mission in Kigali, Joyce Leader, called it a genocide. Uh, Unfortunately, the ambassador didn't understand that. He thought it was just a civil war, and he thought those were mutually exclusive, which of course is not true. Wars and genocides usually go together. Uh, Leaders of genocides must be arrested and tried and imprisoned. I've just been perplexed by the unwillingness of the world's leaders to send in heavily armed commandos to arrest the leaders of genocides before the genocides even happen, the planners, and take them to the trial in The Hague, because you know that complicity or planning of a genocide or all of the other things that lead up to a genocide are in fact themselves crimes under the Genocide Convention. And sure, the ICC should require preliminary hearings and arrest warrants, but right now in Sudan, you've got two genocidists running the country. You know, General Hameti and General Burhan are both genocidists. They're both descendants of Omar al-Bashir in political leadership. And I ask you, why hasn't Vladimir Putin been struck by a missile or something? Because I believe he is a genocidist as well. Uh, what I'm really worried about right now, I believe Nazism is on the rise in the world. I believe it has taken over Russia. I think Putin is basically a Nazi. I think it's also true in China. And I think it's now true in the United States. I believe Donald Trump is a Nazi. You can quote me on that. If you look through the basic characteristics of Nazism, the things that distinguish it from other ideologies, every one of them applies to Donald Trump. The extreme nationalism, the xenophobia, the racism, these are Nazi doctrines. They're the basis of Nazism. The emphasis on patriarchy, the discrimination against women and immigrants. These are Nazi doctrines. So I believe it's also time, and I'll finish with this. It's time to build an international anti-genocide movement on the scale of the anti-slavery movement. We must build the political will for international intervention and prevention when genocide is imminent. That's why we founded Genocide Watch in 1999. At the time we founded it, there wasn't a single organization in the world entirely devoted to the prevention of genocide. There were very good human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others. I was a member of them, in fact. In fact, one of my classmates at Yale Law was Ken Roth, who was the head of Human Rights Watch. But nobody had focused on this, the biggest killer of the 20th century. So when we founded the Alliance Against Genocide, at the same time we founded Genocide Watch, the idea was to create a coalition necessary to mobilize a mass movement. So now there are hundreds of anti-genocide organizations, and I'm, by the way, asking your organization to join us. The Alliance Against Genocide has 125 member organizations in 31 countries now, with thousands of employees. And I believe the movement will continue to grow. I believe we'll have movement people inside governments, because those are where they can have the authority to really take action. I just want to close with this idea. The idea of empathy. Empathy is the ability to place oneself in the shoes of another. It's the measure of a person's moral capacity. Empathy is the expression of satyagraha, that great truth force that Gandhi rediscovered. It was also taught by Buddha, Amos, Jesus, Martin Luther King Jr. Satyagraha is expressed in both justice and love. It has revolutionary power because justice and love flow from the same force. I believe it's the force that created the universe and also created each of us. The more I have worked against genocide, the more I've become convinced that genocide must be defeated locally and by each of us. It can be prevented only by teaching people the empathy for their neighbors that will make them upstanders who will oppose the dehumanization necessary for genocide. I just want to close with a poem that I wrote shortly after the genocide against the Rohingya in Myanmar. And it's simply entitled Justice. Can justice come in courts? Can a widow's tears be dried by trials? Can a raped girl's shame be healed by ceremonies? Can a fatherless child be consoled? What is justice to a woman whose children were slaughtered just before she was raped? What is justice to a bride whose husband's last caress was the last she will ever know? What is justice to a woman who will never trust a man again? What is justice to an orphan in a refugee camp? What is justice to lawyers who still won't call it genocide? Justice is the spirit of the law. Without justice, law is dead, like an empty skull. Without justice, there can be no reconciliation. Without justice, love cannot reweave the social fabric. Without justice, hope dies. Without justice, death conquers life. Justice establishes the truth. Justice restores dignity to the victims. Justice recognizes a widow's grief. Justice is digging up bones and giving them proper burial. Justice is telling stories of suffering to someone who really listens. Justice is confession that your country was responsible. Justice is always having to say you're sorry. Justice struggles to understand why people do such evil. Justice affirms that the rule of law is stronger than rule by force. Justice says murderers cannot get away with genocide. Justice is the antidote to abandonment. Justice is reconnection to the human race. Justice restores the social order. Justice rebalances the moral universe. Justice is God's force, socially expressed. Love is God's force, personally expressed. With justice and love, hope returns. And hope is the assurance that life will triumph over death. Thank you.